New York City, December 12, 1910. A cold Monday morning filled with the noise of horse-drawn carriages, crowded sidewalks, and the rush of holiday shopping. People moved in every direction, wrapped in heavy coats, navigating the season's frenzy. It was a normal day for almost everyone, but for one woman, it was the last day anyone would ever see her. Her name was Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, 25 years old, wealthy, educated, ambitious, a woman determined to carve her place in a world that tried to define her before she could define herself. This was not a crime scene. There was no weapon, no witness to foul play, no body, only a moment in time, swallowed by a city that never stopped moving. Tonight, you will hear one of the most haunting missing person cases in American history. A case full of secrets, pressure, family pride, and the weight of social expectation. And more than a century later, one question still echoes. What happened to Dorothy Arnold? Long before her name became a whispered question in true crime history, Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold lived inside a world that looked perfect from the outside. Old wealth, a stately home on Manhattan's Upper East Side, servants who moved quietly, a father whose fortune shaped every room in the house, a mother who guarded the family's social standing as fiercely as any secret. Yet inside that world, Dorothy was not the woman her family imagined her to be. She was 25, the age when society expected her to choose a husband, settle into a comfortable life, and let the rest of the world drift by. Instead, Dorothy wanted to write, not polite little pieces for dinner tables. Real stories, stories that mattered, stories that came from a place she never truly showed anyone. She studied literature at Bryn Mawr, and classmates remembered something unusual about her. Not rebellion, not arrogance, but a quiet intensity. A focus that felt slightly out of place for someone raised to smile, nod, and keep up appearances. Dorothy had a confidence that drew people in, yet there was a restlessness behind her eyes that friends noticed when she thought no one was looking. A sense that she wanted freedom, but had no clear path toward it. Those closest to her knew she wanted to be published, to see her name in print, to build a future on her own terms. But those dreams did not fit neatly into the life her family had laid out. And in the Arnold household, dreams that did not fit were often tucked away, spoken about in lowered voices, or ignored entirely. Dorothy lived in a period where wealthy women were watched closely. Their choices were judged, their movements were discussed, their reputations mattered more than their ambitions. Every social invitation, every step onto the street, every friendship, every quiet moment had weight. But Dorothy pushed against those expectations, at least in small ways. Private letters to friends hinted that she felt trapped, that her life was not entirely her own, that she longed for something different, something she could not quite put into words. And then slowly, hints of deeper tension appeared. Rejected manuscripts, a strained relationship with her parents, secret trips she hoped no one would trace back, a romance her family refused to approve of, pieces of a life that, when placed together, formed a picture much more complex than the polished portraits of society pages. But what made Dorothy's story so unsettling is not just who she was. It was what she carried beneath the surface. A quiet conflict, a growing pressure, a sense that something in her life was reaching a breaking point. And on the morning she stepped out onto the snowy streets of Manhattan, she carried all of that with her. A heart filled with ambition, a mind filled with frustration, and a future hanging in the balance. In the days before she vanished, Dorothy wrote and revised. She laughed with friends. She kept secrets. She held back tears that no one else saw. She stood between the life expected of her and the life she wanted. Most missing persons cases begin with a simple misunderstanding or a sudden event. But Dorothy's story begins long before her final walk down Fifth Avenue. It begins in the quiet corners of a privileged world where silence meant survival, and truth was something almost nobody dared to speak out loud. Dorothy Arnold was not just another young woman of high society. She was a woman standing on the edge of something she could not escape. And in the end, the silence surrounding her would become as haunting as the disappearance itself. December 12, 1910. A Monday morning wrapped in pale winter light. It was the kind of cold that sharpened the air, making every breath visible and every sound feel strangely amplified. Horses clattered over frozen streets. Streetcars rattled along iron rails. Store windows glowed with holiday displays meant to pull in the crowds. Dorothy Arnold stepped out of her home at 108 East 79th Street just after 11 a.m. She didn't rush. She didn't appear anxious. She didn't seem like someone about to become the center of one of the most perplexing mysteries in American history. She wore a tailored blue velvet walking suit that fit neatly against her frame, a matching hat, a long, finely made coat. Everything about her appearance was polished, graceful, and unmistakably upper class. Anyone who saw her would have assumed she was simply another woman enjoying the holiday season. But here is where the mystery begins to deepen. Dorothy did not tell her mother she had any plans besides shopping for an evening dress. She did not bring an overnight bag. She did not withdraw money. She didn't leave a note or hint she expected anything out of the ordinary. Yet when she closed the front door behind her and began her walk down Fifth Avenue, she walked into the last confirmed hours of her life. Her path that morning became a timeline investigators later clung to desperately. Around 11 a.m., she headed south on Fifth Avenue. Witnesses later remembered her posture, her confident stride, the way she blended into the stream of well-dressed shoppers. Nothing seemed strange. Nothing seemed off. At approximately midday, Dorothy entered Park and Tilford, a fashionable gourmet store known for its imported chocolates and fine goods. Holiday crowds moved shoulder to shoulder, but Dorothy slipped calmly through the doorway. A clerk who served her later described her as pleasant, composed, and entirely normal. She purchased a small box of chocolates and tucked them neatly inside her coat. It may have been an ordinary purchase, but it was the first timestamp investigators could anchor to. One point on a long, dark line. Next, Dorothy walked several blocks down to Brentano's bookstore, one of New York's most famous literary shops. She browsed quietly, her gloved fingers brushing along the spines of new releases. She lingered longer than she had in Park and Tilford, as if she wanted a moment of calm before facing whatever waited outside. Finally, she bought a book of humorous short stories. The cashier remembered her well. She smiled. She made a polite comment. She seemed like someone enjoying a simple afternoon. That small detail became one of the most unsettling parts of this mystery. Dorothy was calm. Dorothy was polite. Dorothy was not distressed. No one could point to a single sign she was planning anything unusual. When Dorothy stepped back outside around 2 p.m., the city had grown even busier. Men in heavy coats hurried past her. Women in long skirts struggled to carry packages. Street vendors shouted over each other. Fifth Avenue was alive, noisy, chaotic. And somewhere within that crowd, Dorothy began her final walk. Investigators would later try to track her route, but this is where her movements dissolved into the pulse of the city. Some believed she turned west toward Central Park. Others believed she continued south, deeper into the crowds. A few claimed to have seen her near streetcar lines. Most sightings collapsed under scrutiny. But no matter the theory, one fact remained the same. Dorothy Arnold left Brentano's, walked into the cold brightness of Fifth Avenue, and vanished without a single scream, a single witness, or a single trace. To this day, what happened in the minutes after she left that bookstore is one of the most puzzling stretches of time in true crime history. Did someone approach her? Did she willingly meet with someone? Did she change direction? Did she sense danger? Did she hide fear behind a calm exterior? No one knows. What should have been a simple walk among holiday shoppers became the beginning of a mystery that would outlive every member of her family and every investigator who searched for her. Dorothy's final confirmed appearance is a moment frozen in time. A young woman in a velvet suit, a book under her arm, a box of chocolates in her coat, and a future that disappeared into the noise of Manhattan. When the sun went down on December 12, 1910, the Arnold household settled into its evening routine. Servants moved quietly through hallways. Lamps glowed against the frost creeping along the windows. Dinner was served at the usual hour, but one chair remained empty. Dorothy's. At first, no one panicked. The Arnolds moved in a world where young women sometimes lingered at a friend's apartment or stayed late at a social engagement. A night out without notice wasn't considered impossible, only impolite. Still, the silence stretched longer than usual. By the time midnight approached, Dorothy's absence no longer felt harmless. It felt strange, off, a wrong note in a house that relied on routine. Her mother waited in the front parlor, listening for the sound of Dorothy's key turning in the lock. But the door stayed closed. Her father, Francis, paced the study, checking the time, reopening the front curtains, watching the empty street. Dorothy had never done something like this before. By morning, the silence turned into something heavier. Not quite fear, but close. Dorothy's bed was undisturbed. There was no note on her dresser, no message at the telephone, no sign she returned at any point during the night. Breakfast came and went untouched. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn into the unusual. Most families, even wealthy ones, would have contacted police once their daughter was missing for an entire night. But the Arnolds did not. Instead, they reached out quietly to Dorothy's friends. They placed calls. They asked questions. They hoped someone would say Dorothy had spent the night elsewhere. They hoped this was an embarrassing misunderstanding, not a crisis. But no one had seen her. No one had heard from her. No one knew anything. Despite this, her father refused to involve the authorities. Why? Here's the explanation he later gave. We feared the publicity. In 1910, wealthy families were judged harshly. A daughter reported missing could spark scandal, whispers, and headlines that reached every corner of New York. In the Arnold world, reputation mattered almost more than truth. And so the day passed in a strange pause. A missing woman, a worried family, yet no police, no public alert, no search teams walking the streets of Manhattan. Only quiet inquiries and a growing dread no one dared voice. As the hours stretched, tension inside the Arnold home grew sharper. Servants exchanged nervous glances. Mary Arnold appeared increasingly distressed. Francis grew stern and withdrawn, snapping at anyone who asked too many questions. Behind closed doors, they debated what to do. Behind closed doors, they tried to piece together possibilities. Behind closed doors, a decision was made that investigators would later call one of the greatest mistakes in the case. They would keep the situation private, they would wait, and they would hope. But with every passing minute, that silence allowed the window for answers to close. This wasn't ordinary caution. It wasn't simple optimism. It was something deeper, something rigid and proud, something tied to a family that valued appearances more than vulnerability. Days passed, still no word. Finally, quietly, without informing the police, the Arnolds hired private detectives. They insisted on discretion. They demanded secrecy. They wanted answers, yes, but on their terms. The detectives searched hospitals. They checked with friends. They surveyed parks and bookstores. They walked the same streets Dorothy had walked just hours before she vanished, and found nothing. No witnesses, no footprint, no dropped belongings, no one who even remembered seeing her after she stepped out of Brentano's. The detectives returned to the Arnold home with empty hands and unsettling news. If Dorothy had vanished voluntarily, she left no trace. If something had happened to her, it happened quietly and without witnesses. Either possibility was disturbing. Either possibility meant time was slipping away. Yet even then, the Arnolds did not call the police. Not after one day. Not after two. Not after a week. Nearly 6 weeks passed before Dorothy's family informed the authorities. By then, the trail was lost. Evidence was gone. Witnesses forgot details. Leads grew cold. The city had moved on. And the silence that began in the Arnold household became the silence that swallowed the truth. The case had already slipped out of reach. Beneath Dorothy Arnold's polished exterior, beneath the polite conversations she offered at dinner parties and the effortless poise expected of a woman of her class, there was a relationship her family fought hard to ignore. His name was George Griscom Jr. To some, he was charming. To others, he was reckless. To the Arnolds, he was unacceptable. Dorothy met George through social circles that often blended wealth with gossip. He came from a well-established Pittsburgh family, but he had a reputation that followed him quietly through upper-class whispers. A man who enjoyed travel, a man who spent freely, a man who didn't seem in any hurry to settle down or grow responsible. But to Dorothy, George was something entirely different. He was someone who listened, someone who encouraged her writing dreams, someone who treated her like a woman capable of her own choices. That alone made their relationship dangerous in the eyes of her family. In early 1910, Dorothy traveled alone to Boston to meet George for a weekend. For a young woman of her social station, this was scandalous. When her parents found out, they did not scold her, they humiliated her. Francis Arnold told his daughter that her behavior had disgraced the family. He threatened to forbid her from seeing George again. He insisted she was tarnishing the Arnold name, as if her own hopes and desires were a threat. Dorothy tried to hide the pain from her friends, but they noticed the shift. Something inside her had cracked, a small fracture formed from the weight of expectations she could never fully meet. Yet she kept seeing George. Their relationship continued in secret letters and carefully planned meetings. It wasn't reckless love. It wasn't impulsive teenage infatuation. It was quiet, persistent, and real, something Dorothy clung to even as her family pushed against it. This growing tension became another layer in her life that hid beneath the surface. Another piece of the puzzle investigators would later struggle to interpret. Then came the manuscript. Dorothy poured her heart into her writing, crafting stories she hoped would prove she could succeed on her own terms. She submitted one to a well-known magazine, hoping this moment would be the breakthrough she longed for. They rejected it. The word cut deeper than anyone knew, not because the story failed, but because she feared she failed. Friends later recalled how defeated she seemed, how the rejection seemed to confirm everything her parents believed. That writing was a childish dream, that she wasn't good enough, that she would never make a name for herself outside her family's wealth. In the days before her disappearance, Dorothy confided in her friend Frances. The conversation grew serious. Dorothy admitted she was unhappy, and then she said something chilling. Mother would faint if she knew the life I lead. What did she mean? Was it about George, about the rejection, about something deeper? The truth remains buried in time. When Dorothy vanished, George was thousands of miles away, vacationing in Europe. He had no idea she was missing until weeks later, when a private investigator hired by the Arnolds tracked him down in Italy. He was stunned. He insisted he knew nothing. He said her disappearance made no sense. Then he revealed something the Arnolds had kept quiet. Dorothy had written to him just days before she vanished. Her words were emotional, unsettled. She described feeling discouraged about her writing. She hinted that life at home felt suffocating. And in that letter was a single line that investigators clung to. I am so blue that I would like to do something desperate. Desperate how? Desperate in what sense? George swore he didn't understand the meaning. He insisted she wasn't the type to run away, to hide, or to harm herself. He believed she was alive. He believed she would come back. But the Arnold family didn't trust him. Not with Dorothy. Not with the truth. Not with anything that might cast shadows on their carefully maintained reputation. This secret relationship, disapproved, discouraged, concealed, became one of the most powerful threads in the mystery. It introduced motive for sorrow, for shame, for rebellion, for running away, or for something far more sinister. But it also raised a haunting question. If Dorothy was struggling so much beneath the weight of her family, her dreams, and her forbidden relationship, why did no one see her breaking? Or did someone see it and choose to ignore it? By early January of 1911, nearly 6 weeks after Dorothy Arnold vanished, the silence surrounding her disappearance finally cracked. A simple statement from the Arnolds reached the press. Within hours, the city erupted. Newspapers scrambled for headlines, journalists sprinted into print rooms with late-breaking updates, and all across New York, whispers began to grow legs. A missing heiress, a secretive family, no clues. No body, the perfect storm for a city addicted to intrigue. The New York papers turned Dorothy's story into front-page drama. They printed her photograph, sharp and elegant, with eyes that seemed almost too calm for the chaos her disappearance would unleash. How does a woman vanish on Fifth Avenue? Where is Miss Arnold? Society girl missing for weeks. Every headline pulled the public deeper into speculation. And where facts ended, imagination rushed in. Rumors spread like wildfire. No two stories were the same, yet each claimed certainty. Theory 1, a secret pregnancy and a disastrous procedure. One whisper grew louder than all the others, that Dorothy was pregnant and that a failed procedure had taken her life. It started with anonymous letters mailed to newsrooms and detectives. Hints, accusations. Someone knows what happened, they said. Some claimed she visited a private clinic. Others insisted she sought help from a midwife operating in secret behind locked doors. No writers gave names or dates, just fragments. Fragments that fed the fire. Investigators followed these tips, searching for any trace of truth. They found nothing, no appointment records, no witnesses, nothing to prove the rumor. Still, the idea stuck. Not because it was proven, but because people believed tragedy felt more believable than disappearance. Theory 2, suicide in Central Park. Another theory claimed Dorothy walked into Central Park and ended her life somewhere quiet, where no one would see. Winter had hardened the ground. Snow covered every forgotten corner. Some said her body could have been hidden under ice or lost in thick underbrush. But this theory weakened quickly. Central Park detectives searched the grounds with thorough precision. They combed the lake edges, wooded paths, bridges, and shoreline. If a body had been left there, someone believed they would have found it. They never did. Theory 3, abduction in the crowd. A darker rumor lingered in the public's mind, that Dorothy had been abducted, dragged into a carriage, forced into a private home, or taken while her family stalled the investigation. At first glance, Fifth Avenue seemed too crowded for this, too public, too exposed. But detectives admitted something unsettling. In the crush of holiday shoppers, someone could vanish in seconds. One misstep into a quiet side street, one carriage pulling up to the curb. One moment where no one is looking. The city was massive. People went missing all the time. But Dorothy was different. Her disappearance felt intentional. Theory 4, the family hid something. Then came the whisper no one wanted to say out loud. That maybe, just maybe, the Arnold family themselves were hiding the truth. This theory took root not from facts, but from behavior. Their 6-week delay in reporting her missing, their insistence on private detectives instead of police, their refusal to entertain certain questions, their quick dismissal of certain leads even before they were fully investigated, and their fierce determination to protect the family name above all else. Was this guilt? Was this fear? Or was it simply pride that led them to handle everything in the shadows? No one knew. But the public believed wealthy families were capable of burying scandal in ways ordinary people could not. And Dorothy's disappearance, wrapped in silence and secrecy, made people wonder if the truth had been tucked behind locked doors. Theory 5, she ran away to start a new life. Some believed Dorothy boarded a ship, using cash she kept hidden, and slipped away into a new life. Europe, South America, anywhere she could breathe without judgment. It was a romantic theory, an empowering one. A theory built on the idea that Dorothy wanted freedom so badly she erased herself to get it. But investigators noted something important. Dorothy left no evidence she planned a long-term escape. No luggage, no withdrawals, no farewell messages, no secret savings. If she planned to vanish, she left like someone expecting to return home by dinner. Rumors multiplied until they overshadowed the truth. They shaped Dorothy's story more than the actual facts ever could. People debated her fate in cafes, streetcars, and dinner parlors. Every theory sounded possible. Every theory sounded impossible. And as all of New York was swept into a storm of speculation, the most important detail was slowly lost. Not one rumor brought investigators any closer to finding Dorothy. Not one whisper uncovered a clue. Not one theory produced evidence. Not one person could say, with certainty, they saw what happened after she stepped out of Brentano's bookstore. What the public didn't realize was that while they devoured every sensational headline, the real story, the one buried inside Dorothy's life, was only getting darker. While New York spiraled into rumor and speculation, another man found himself pulled unwillingly into the center of Dorothy Arnold's disappearance. A man half a world away. A man Dorothy loved in defiance of her family's expectations. George Griscom Jr. When private investigators finally tracked him down in Florence, Italy, he was living comfortably in a hotel surrounded by warm Mediterranean sunlight, completely unaware that his name had begun slipping into New York's most heated conversations. One moment he was preparing to take lunch. The next, he was staring at an investigator who had traveled across the Atlantic with a single question: where is Dorothy Arnold? The shock hit George like a physical blow. He insisted he had no idea she was missing. No messages from her, no telegrams, no strange letters. He had left New York months earlier and believed Dorothy was safely at home, navigating the friction between her family and her writing ambitions. Then investigators revealed the truth. Dorothy had vanished 6 weeks earlier. George was stunned. He asked the same questions the public had been asking for weeks: how, why, where? And then, quietly, almost reluctantly, he revealed something her family had kept hidden from the world. He had received a letter from Dorothy shortly before she disappeared. The room fell silent as George recounted the letter's contents. Dorothy had written about her writing, how her latest manuscript had been rejected, how discouraged she felt, how defeated. She admitted she was embarrassed to tell her parents. She felt the walls tightening around her, the pressure of her family's expectations squeezing her ambition from every direction. But what haunted the investigators most was the tone George described. Dorothy sounded emotional, overwhelmed but not hopeless, until one line, a line that hovered like a ghost over the investigation for decades. "I am so blue that I would like to do something desperate." The detectives wrote it down word for word. Desperate, not reckless, not tragic, desperate, a word soaked in ambiguity, a word that could mean anything, a word Dorothy herself had chosen. But George insisted he didn't believe she intended harm, not to herself and not to her future. Investigators pressed him. Did she say she wanted to run away? Did she hint at boarding a ship? Did she fear her parents? Did she mention another rendezvous? George denied it all. He said Dorothy was emotional, yes, disappointed, certainly, but not unstable, not someone planning to vanish. If she intended a dramatic escape, he believed she would have told him. But investigators weren't satisfied. They insisted on seeing the letter. George hesitated, perhaps out of embarrassment, perhaps because the letter contained feelings he believed were private, or perhaps because he feared the public would twist her words into something she never intended. But eventually, he showed it. The letter was emotional but not frantic, reflective but not desperate, except for the now infamous line. The bulk of the writing revolved around her disappointment over her rejected story and the strain she felt at home. Nothing pointed directly to a plan. Nothing indicated she was meeting someone. Nothing suggested she was about to disappear. Yet the investigators couldn't ignore how powerful despair can be, especially in someone who felt trapped between who she was and who everyone else expected her to be. They scrutinized the letter for hidden clues. They looked for coded phrases, secret messages, signals that would reveal her next move. They found nothing. George Griscom wasn't just a boyfriend. He was the last person known to have received a piece of Dorothy's inner life, a snapshot of her mind shortly before she vanished. Yet the Arnolds had kept him at arm's length from the start. They didn't allow him into their home. They rejected his offer to help in the search. They resented his role in Dorothy's life. And investigators wondered, was this simply disapproval? Or did the Arnolds know something about the relationship they weren't saying? George remained cooperative. He wrote to Dorothy's mother. He pleaded for updates. He even placed an advertisement in the newspapers, hoping she would read it somewhere. "Dorothy, all is forgiven. Come home." But no reply ever came. The investigators left Italy with more questions than answers. The letter proved Dorothy was emotional before she vanished, but not unstable, not frantic, not suicidal, just overwhelmed. Which raised the most unsettling question yet. If Dorothy was planning something, why didn't she tell George? And if she wasn't planning anything, why did her final words feel like a warning? The letter, intimate, emotional, cryptic, became one of the central pillars of the case and one of its deepest shadows. It hinted at despair, but not enough to explain disappearance. It hinted at secrets, but not enough to reveal them. It hinted at pressure, but not enough to tell the world what finally caused Dorothy to step off the map completely. Her final written words lingered like frost on a window pane. I would like to do something desperate. And a century later, we still don't know if that was a confession or a coincidence. By late winter, 6 weeks had passed since Dorothy Arnold stepped onto Fifth Avenue and vanished. Detectives had followed leads from Newark to Boston, from steamship terminals to the darkest corners of Manhattan, chasing every rumor, every whisper, every anonymous letter dripping with false hope. But for all the noise surrounding the case, the truth remained painfully silent. The trail had gone cold, and the deeper investigators dug, the more the shadows pushed back. The most disturbing part of the investigation was not what detectives found, but what they couldn't find. No confirmed sightings after Brentano's bookstore. No one who recalled her crossing a specific street. No store clerk who noticed something strange. Not even a casual witness who remembered a young woman matching her description in distress. In a city of 500,000 people, Dorothy Arnold simply vanished between one shop door and the next. Detectives retraced her steps again and again, hoping they had overlooked something small. A moment, a gesture, a clue. They found nothing. It was as if the moment she walked out of Brentano's, the world somehow stopped noticing her. For the first time, police began to consider a chilling possibility. If Dorothy wasn't seen after she left the bookstore, if no eyewitness ever placed her farther down Fifth Avenue, if no one remembered her at all, maybe she never made it farther. Maybe something happened immediately after she stepped out onto the sidewalk. A sudden abduction, a forced entry into a waiting carriage, a shove through an open doorway, a quick, practiced movement carried out by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who could make a woman disappear without a scream. It seemed impossible, but so did everything else. The detectives realized they were dealing with a case that didn't behave like a runaway, a suicide, or even a romantic escape. This was something else. One lead briefly reignited hope. A woman working at a rooming house in New York claimed she had seen a girl resembling Dorothy collapse in the hallway weeks earlier. She said the girl was injured. She was frightened, and she seemed to be calling out for help. Detectives arrived instantly. The building smelled of dust and stale tobacco. Every floorboard groaned under their feet. It was the kind of place where secrets were easy to hide, because no one cared enough to ask questions. The woman insisted the injured girl was Dorothy. She described her clothing, her hair, her frightened expression, and then she claimed 2 men carried the girl away. For a brief moment, investigators felt the spark of a real break in the case. But the story fell apart. Tenants contradicted the woman. Her timeline didn't match. And worse, she changed key details every time she retold the story. The lead collapsed under its own weight. Still, the image lingered in the investigators' minds. A frightened woman dragged away, a cry swallowed by a dark hallway. Even false leads had a way of staining the imagination. As the weeks stretched into months, New York's fascination with the case twisted into something darker. People began seeing Dorothy everywhere, on street corners, on trains, in hotel lobbies, walking past them in the market. Of course, none of these sightings were real. They were projections. People wanted to be part of the story, or they feared becoming part of the next one. Yet every claimed sighting forced detectives to divert resources, investigate, interview, confirm, then dismiss. The case had become flooded with noise. And through it all, the Arnolds clung to one belief: Dorothy was alive. Not because they had proof, but because believing she was dead meant accepting a truth too unbearable to face. It was around this time that private investigators approached the Arnold family with a grim proposal. There was one place they had not searched, one possibility they had tried to avoid, one outcome too painful to consider: the morgue. Detectives wanted to compare Dorothy's physical description to every unidentified woman found in New York since the day she disappeared. It was an agonizing request. Francis Arnold hesitated. His wife broke down, but eventually they agreed. The investigators made the trip alone. Corridor after corridor, sheets pulled back, unidentified victims who would never be claimed, faces robbed of identity by winter, water, violence, or simple misfortune. Nothing matched Dorothy. It was a small relief, but it wasn't closure. It only deepened the mystery. By late spring, the story of Dorothy Arnold was no longer front-page news. New York had found new dramas, new scandals, new tragedies. The city moved on. But detectives knew the truth. They were no closer to finding Dorothy Arnold than they had been on the very first day. No body, no letters, no confirmed sightings, no clues, no suspects, no crime scene. Her disappearance had gone from alarming to confounding to legendary, and the deeper investigators searched, the more the case seemed to fold in on itself. A vanishing that behaved like a magic trick, a crime with no evidence, a story with no final chapter. Yet the emptiness of the investigation did something no clue ever could. It suggested that if Dorothy didn't leave willingly, then someone else had controlled her fate. Someone who knew how to make a woman disappear in broad daylight and never be found. As the months rolled into a new year, the Arnold household transformed into a silent fortress. Curtains stayed drawn, visitors were turned away. Reporters camped outside the front gate, hoping for a statement, but none came. Behind closed doors, the family drifted further into two parallel worlds. The public believed the Arnolds knew more than they were saying, but inside the home, a more painful truth loomed. They knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. And into that void stepped a stream of letters that promised answers, but delivered only torment. The first ransom letter arrived neatly folded, typed on cheap paper. It demanded thousands of dollars and claimed Dorothy was being held by criminals who would release her upon payment. Francis Arnold examined the letter quietly, his jaw tightening as he read. It didn't sound like Dorothy. It didn't contain a detail only she would know. It felt like a stranger fishing for money. Still, investigators followed protocol. They analyzed the paper, the ink, the typewriter impressions. None matched anything familiar, none connected to Dorothy. More ransom letters followed. Some threatened violence if payment wasn't made. Others claimed she was already dead. One contained a cryptic riddle. Another suggested she had been taken out of state. But all had one thing in common. They were lies. Cruel hopes dangled in front of a family desperate for truth. At the height of it, the Arnolds were receiving several letters a week. Every one had to be opened, read, investigated, dismissed. Each false lead drained the family further, like water slipping through cracks in the floor. Over time, the case attracted people who claimed they knew exactly what happened. A drifter in the Bowery swore he had overheard two men discussing a woman's body dumped into a river, but he couldn't give names or dates or even confirm the river. A man in Chicago walked into a police station and claimed he helped bury Dorothy's body in a cellar. His story changed every time he told it. A woman insisted Dorothy had run off to become an actress under a fake name. Investigators checked every small theater they could. Not one actress resembled her. And then came the strangest confession of all. A prisoner claimed that he and two accomplices kidnapped Dorothy on Fifth Avenue, held her captive, and disposed of her body. Detectives pressed him for locations, physical descriptions, evidence. He couldn't provide any. He was looking for publicity, or sympathy, or a reduced sentence. He received none of the above. But each confession, each whispered claim, forced investigators to backtrack, to question everything they thought they knew, to reopen files they had already closed. It was like chasing ghosts, ghosts that dissolved the moment you reached for them. One particular letter stood out from the rest. It arrived anonymously, typed with precision, and mailed from Pittsburgh. It claimed Dorothy was alive but ill. It claimed she had been taken across state lines. It claimed she was being kept by someone she knew. Unlike the other letters, this one had a tone that chilled investigators. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't threatening, it wasn't embellished, it was quiet, measured, almost calm. Detectives traveled to Pittsburgh. They interviewed postal clerks, hotel staff, factory workers, boarding house owners, but no one recognized the handwriting or knew anything about the letter. The lead ended as quickly as it had begun. Still, there was something about that message, the tone, the restraint, the absence of obvious lies. For years afterward, investigators returned to it, wondering if it had been the one letter that wasn't meant to mislead. But without proof, it joined the pile of unanswered questions. Inside the Arnold home, the emotional weight became unbearable. Judith Arnold, Dorothy's mother, withdrew almost completely from society. She stopped attending luncheons, stopped visiting friends, stopped traveling. She clung to the belief her daughter was still alive. She said it again and again, Dorothy will come home. But Francis changed. At first, he had been composed, controlled, determined to handle the case privately, away from scandal. But as the year passed and leads dried up, something in him hardened. He spoke less, aged rapidly, became impatient with detectives, dismissed anyone who offered help. One evening, in a moment of frustration, he snapped at a reporter outside his home. "My daughter is dead. I am certain of it." It was the first time he had said the words publicly. It shook everyone, investigators, reporters, even members of his extended family. But what frightened the public most wasn't what he said. It was that he wouldn't explain why he believed it. No evidence, no witness, no discovery, just certainty. And when pressed, Francis refused to elaborate. Whatever convinced him, he took it to his grave. By the second year, the case slipped from the front page to the margins. A new scandal replaced it, then another and another. But for detectives, something lingered. Something about the case refused to settle. A disappearance without panic, a timeline without gaps, a life without any markers of escape or self-harm. It didn't add up. Not in 1910, not 10 years later, not a century later. The city might have moved on, but Dorothy's story refused to fade. Her absence became a presence. A void that filled itself with speculation, fear, legend, and every unanswered letter, every false confession, every whispered rumor only made the truth harder to see. Dorothy Arnold was no longer just missing, she had become a mystery that refused to die. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of memory. But in the case of Dorothy Arnold, the years did the opposite. They sharpened the mystery. The case did not fade quietly. It lingered like a cold draft through a closed window, always present, always felt, even when the world pretended not to notice. Every few years, the story resurfaced. Newspapers revisited it. Detectives revisited it. Family acquaintances whispered about it over dinner, long after society had moved on. Dorothy's absence had become part of New York's mythology, an unsolved riddle that refused to loosen its grip. And as the decades passed, everything only grew more complicated. Years after Dorothy vanished, new leads continued to arrive like ghosts that had missed their chance to haunt the living. A woman in California insisted she met a quiet, educated East Coast heiress who claimed to be running from her life. A hotel clerk in Canada swore he had seen a young woman matching Dorothy's description checking in under a false name. A nurse in Ohio believed her patient, a troubled woman near death, whispered, "My real name is Dorothy Arnold," before she passed. But every claim carried the same problem. No evidence, no signatures, no physical connection to Dorothy. Just stories drifting from place to place like smoke. Investigators followed some of them, ignored others, but none brought them closer to the truth. Each new lead was a reminder of how impossible the case had become. Too old to solve, too famous to abandon. As time went on, one theory gained traction among investigators, not because it was proven, but because it filled the gaps more cleanly than the others. The idea that Dorothy had died during an illegal procedure and that her body had been discreetly removed. This theory resurfaced in the 1920s when a New York doctor, known for performing secret operations, allegedly made a cryptic comment about a Park Avenue girl who died on the table years ago. It was never confirmed. The doctor denied it. No records existed. No witnesses stepped forward. And yet, investigators privately admitted the theory terrified them with its plausibility. It explained the complete disappearance, the lack of evidence, the absence of a struggle, the silence that followed, and the feud between Dorothy and her family during her final months. But even this theory had a fatal flaw. There was no proof Dorothy ever visited such a place on the day she vanished. No documentation, no first-hand account, just a rumor that fit too well. The Arnold family grew smaller as the years passed. Dorothy's mother, Judith, remained certain her daughter had simply run away. She died holding on to hope, insisting until her last breath that Dorothy would someday walk back through their front door. Her father, Francis, carried a different burden. Though he never publicly revealed the reason, he became convinced, absolutely convinced, that Dorothy was dead. His certainty hardened so deeply that when he amended his will, he stated plainly, "I have no daughter named Dorothy." It wasn't cruelty, it was resignation, a way of closing a wound that had never healed. Behind those words was the weight of a man crushed by a mystery he could never solve. He died without ever knowing what truly happened. Dorothy's former lover, George Griscom Jr., also lived out the rest of his days under the shadow of her disappearance. He married later in life, settled quietly, avoided interviews, dodged reporters, but those who knew him claimed he never fully recovered from the event, nor from the backlash he received from the Arnold family. He too went to his grave without answers. By the late 1930s, surviving detectives who had once worked the case began to speak more openly. In a rare moment of candor, one of them admitted, "It was the one case that never let me rest." They had handled murders, kidnappings, organized crime, high-profile scandals, but Dorothy's disappearance haunted them in a different way, because it wasn't just a crime. It was a vanishing act, something that defied every rule of investigation. A woman seen walking in the brightest part of the city, gone before reaching the next corner. They said the case felt like holding sand. Every time they thought they had something solid, it slipped through their fingers. By the time half a century had passed, the mystery of Dorothy Arnold had outlived everyone who knew her. Her parents, her siblings, her lover, the detectives who chased her trail, the neighbors who whispered her name, the reporters who wrote her headlines, all gone. The only thing that remained was the question. The biggest unsolved disappearance of early 20th century New York. A riddle with no last page. Dorothy Arnold's story became a legend not because of what we know, but because of everything we don't. More than a century has passed since the morning Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold left her family's home on the upper end of Manhattan and stepped into history's most persistent shadow. In that time, the world has changed in every imaginable way. New York rose into the sky with steel and ambition. Generations lived and died. Crimes that once shocked the nation were solved with modern science, modern tracing, modern truth. But Dorothy's case stood still, frozen. Right where she vanished. The street where she took her final known steps is still one of the busiest in the world, overflowing with people, noise, and movement. Thousands walk the same stretch of pavement every day, unaware that beneath their stride lies one of the oldest unsolved mysteries in American history. A disappearance so clean, so total, so absolute, that even today, seasoned investigators shake their heads in disbelief. To understand why Dorothy's story endures, you have to step into the silence she left behind. The unanswered questions refuse to fade. Did she leave Fifth Avenue willingly? Or was she taken? Did she run from her life? Or was she running towards something? Did her family hide something out of shame? Or did they simply not know where to look? Was George Griscom the last person to truly understand her state of mind? Or was he the final person she deliberately kept in the dark? Did she die that very day? Or survive long enough to adopt another name, another life, another fate no one could trace? Every question branches into a dozen more. Every theory creates a darker, more labyrinthine path. And with no evidence, no body, no belongings, no witness, Dorothy's disappearance remains locked in its own sealed room. A room with no door, no window, just echoes. When investigators look back on the case now, they speak of it with a kind of sober respect. They say Dorothy's disappearance is one of the rare cases where every standard tool of investigation fails. Not because it was clever, not because it was planned, but because the moment she vanished, the world around her offered no anchor points, no starting line. One detective wrote in his memoir, "She vanished between one heartbeat and the next." And that is why her story still holds power. Because humans leave traces. We leave footprints, fingerprints, witnesses, mistakes. Dorothy left nothing. That nothingness became her legacy, a blank chapter where a life should have continued. Dorothy's parents went to their graves without closure. Her lover faded into his later years, with her memory trailing behind him like a shadow he could never shake. Her siblings built their lives in a world where their sister was both everywhere and nowhere. And the investigators, hardened men who solved murders, dismantled gangs, and cracked cold cases, admitted privately that Dorothy Arnold's disappearance haunted them, not because they failed, but because the case resisted answers at every turn. Some believed she died the day she vanished. Others insisted she escaped the city under a false identity. A few thought she met with foul play, her body hidden by someone who truly understood how to erase a life. But none of these theories ever earned proof, not even a sliver. Today, the legend of Dorothy Arnold lives in the collective consciousness of true crime enthusiasts, historians, and storytellers. Her case predates modern forensics, predates centralized missing persons databases, predates the kind of interagency cooperation that could have uncovered the smallest thread. And yet, even with over a century of hindsight, advanced investigative techniques, and endless analysis, the case remains exactly where it began. A woman walking down Fifth Avenue on a cold December day, then vanishing into thin air. Her story is a reminder that even in a city bursting with people, sound, and motion, someone can disappear completely. Without struggle, without noise, without a single trace. That is what makes her legend endure. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was prominent, not because the newspapers loved the scandal. Her story endures because her disappearance should have been impossible. And yet it happened. Think about it. One moment, Dorothy Arnold was a hopeful writer searching for a book to inspire her next story. She smiled at the clerk. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. The city wrapped around her like it always did. And then, nothing. The world never saw her again. That gap, that impossible silence, is the heart of the mystery. It is what has kept her story alive for more than a century. It is what pulls us in, decade after decade. It is why we still talk about her, why we still guess, why we still wonder. Because it is not just a disappearance. It is a moment frozen in time, a moment with no resolution, a moment that asks us to decide for ourselves what really happened. So now we turn to you. After hearing every theory, every clue, every dead end, and every haunting detail, what do you think happened to Dorothy Arnold? Was she the victim of a crime that New York never uncovered? Did she leave of her own free will, determined to escape the life she felt trapped in? Or was her disappearance the tragic result of a secret she carried alone? Tell us your theory in the comments. Because in a case this old, this cold, and this carved into legend, the truth may only survive if we keep searching for it. Next time, we'll explore another case, one that echoes the same haunting questions, where truth hides in plain sight and time refuses to let go. If you want to see it first, make sure to subscribe and join me again for another story that refuses to be forgotten. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some mysteries never fade.